I have our lovable and, as I said, down-to-earth psychologist here in the studio, Carlos Camacho. Hi, Carlos.
Hi, Deb.
You are lovable and you are very down-to-earth. The advice you give to people is just very straightforward and from your heart, and that's what we love about you.
Well, I'm not going to interrupt you. I don't mind people talking well about
me. Want me to say more?
How long do we have?
About 10 minutes. I could probably fill it up, but you'll have to help me.
Thank you very much for the introduction.
Okay. Today, we're talking about overcoming depression. I have a friend who's going through a bit at the moment, and she's sort of needing tips to help her in the way of overcoming depression, to get her on her way to getting back to healthy again. Any suggestions?
Yes. Obviously, depression is one of the most popular of our disorders that we treat as psychologists. Also, psychiatrists and counsellors treat a lot of people and talk to a lot of people that have the symptoms of depression. Now, there's two types of depression. One is, if you like, a physiological type, which is pretty much triggered by the brain itself. Mm-hmm. So some people have a disposition, we call it. That's a very biological term, a disposition towards depression. So things that may depress some people or may not depress some people may actually affect them. It's a bit like having a disposition towards asthma. A child is born and the doctor may say, your child may develop asthma, and that's just a disposition. They may or they may not, depending on the circumstances. With depression, it's similar. So as a person who has that disposition may grow and be exposed to certain situations and may or may not experience, but will obviously have a higher probability of having it. Then there's reactive depression, which is environmental. It's triggered through environmental incidents, and also obviously we are all exposed to that.
That's right. So not necessarily hereditary.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, so ways to actually to beat this depression. What are your tips on that? How do you start about trying to get it back in check and getting your mental health back in line?
I always assume that it's a mixture of both, that it could be physiological, that it could be chemical, if you like, biological, the brain, if you like, and there also is an influence of the environment. So we could also, if you like, summarize that as the mind, the emotions, if you like. So if we tackle both, so one is, I think the first thing we can do is prepare and organize a lifestyle that is good for us.
Okay.
So a very good bed routine, regular exercise, and healthy eating. If we do those three things, we're on a good track.
Okay.
And that's a good start, definitely. If symptoms persist, then we may look at maybe medication, but also things like cognitive behavioral therapy and other forms of therapy that are practical may well influence. And things like we talked about last time, I think a few weeks ago, even last year, we talked a lot of that that practical approach that we looked at, that is based on a lot of looking at the present, that mindset where we can let go of the past and work on the future.
That's right. Otherwise, we're just living behind or in front of us and not enjoying this moment that we're in right now.
And we call that mindfulness, remember?
It is. It is too.
And it's very important also, I think, one of the things that I'm looking at now and researching a lot and trying to get people on board is trying to also look at the things we do have, because in psychology, especially in clinical psychology, we look at a lot at the negative symptoms. So when we look at clinical depression, we look at some of the negative symptoms that are taking over the person's being, if you like, but there are a lot of positives in the person's life. I really enjoy looking at those. And I have this thing called Pat Yourself on the Back, at least once a month.
Okay.
I've actually got a little website going on Facebook, and it's called Pat Yourself on the Back. Every 16th of the month, we just ask people just to reflect on the things you have achieved, the things that you have done well that month. And that helps a lot because there's so much emphasis on what we haven't achieved yet. You know, those motivational speakers, and that's all great. It's never enough, and that's fine to progress. But also there's a time where we have to look at the things we have achieved and feel happy also. Yeah. I think also that helps tremendously.
And the things that we have right within us. So we might be a depressed person, say, but we don't put that out to the world and be really helpful and loving and giving to our friends, so we should pat ourselves on the back for that.
That's right. And that's related to self-esteem, obviously. Pat yourself on the back start from birth. See how far you've come, considering your parents and considering where you were born and the time you were born and how far you've come. You'll be surprised how many good things you've achieved.
Yes.
And from month to month, just remind yourself. It's great to look at yourself in the mirror and say, hey, Carlos, hey, you've done well since last time. Sure, there's a few things to do, but look at everything you've achieved up to now and remind ourselves, really go through it, because the mind gets confused. If we put too much pressure on ourselves, that depresses us also.
Okay.
We start being affected, our self-esteem starts lowering because we compare ourselves to others maybe, or maybe we've set unrealistic goals.
That we used to be, and maybe we're not the same now.
Exactly. And that's a great way to combat depression. I would say to you to have a chat to your friend.
I will.
To say, look, let's look at the positive. Start looking at the positive things you've achieved and make a list. I bet there are a lot of them.
I was going to say make a list. Go back in your life and write down all the things that you've achieved. Or you can't write everything, but the major ones that make you feel good. Maybe even that you've raised a beautiful family who are great citizens. That's a big thing, isn't it?
That cannot be underestimated. That is one of the biggest things we can do.
Yes.
Is make sure that as we get older and we eventually leave, that we've left good people on the earth.
That's right.
That is not small feat.
It's not, is it? It's great for society as well, isn't it?
It's wonderful. It's pretty much what we're here for, isn't it? Like most other animals on Earth.
We are. Yeah, well, thanks, Carlos.
No, that's okay. It's very important to, when we talk about depression, because it can be very confusing for people. And the word itself is quite a downer, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. We're going to talk about depression, and you said, no, overcoming depression just is much better than saying depression.
That's right. And there are people, look, the reality is, and I see them every day in my practice, there are people that will require ongoing treatment and even medication on a daily basis, but they can function well these days, just like an asthmatic can.
Yeah.
Just because you have a disposition towards depression doesn't mean you are depressed all the time, just like an asthmatic doesn't have an asthma attack all the time. They can take care of themselves, they can understand what triggers it, but put it in the back of your mind and live your life to the fullest, appreciating what you have, and pat yourself on the back.
And surround yourself with beautiful, uplifting people probably is a really good idea, isn't it?
Definitely.
If you can.
Yes, and you can, because you have no responsibility to keep people that are keeping you back.
That's
I call them ankle grabbers.
Yeah, ankle grabbers.
You're trying to climb a wall and someone's pulling at your ankle. They don't want to climb.
Yeah, but they don't want
you to climb.
Yeah.
So you need to let those people go.
Yes, that's right. Great advice there, Carlos.
Thank you.
Talk to you again next week.
Definitely.
Okay, and the song you've chosen, I love it.
Yeah, one of my favourite Aussie bands of all time, and internationally too, In Excess. And I love this song, one of their first hits. Such a beautiful song, and it's a bit relevant to today because there's a lot of things we want to change in our life through psychology, but you know what? There's some things that you shouldn't, that's part of you, and don't change.
Love yourself for who you are.
Exactly.
Here it is, In Excess. Don't change on Coast FM 963.